Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello and welcome to LawPod. I am Dr. Lauren Dempster. I'm a lecturer at the School of Law in Queen's University Belfast. You're joining a very special series of LawPod. We are recording these episodes at the European Society of Criminology Conference in Malaga. It's September 2022, and we want to bring you a snapshot of some of the key criminology research that's being presented at this conference. I'm delighted in this first episode to be joined by Dr. David Rodriguez Goyes. And David, could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. So I am Colombian. I'm also a lawyer, and then I took some master programs in sociology and criminology, and then I moved to Norway to do the PhD in criminology. And now I am a senior researcher in criminology at the Department for Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, David. We can include a link in our show notes to your profile and your publications, so if any of our listeners want to follow up on that, they can. David, you're talking to us today about your research on climate change from a Southern perspective. So to begin, could you perhaps set the scene? I mean, obviously we know that there's a differential impact in terms of the effects of climate change in the global south, but could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like currently?
So this is very interesting because climate change is, of course, a global phenomenon, meaning that it impacts everyone. But people are prepared differently to respond to climate change, right? So there are some people with more money, more power, and so on, to try and do something about climate change, either to prevent it or to protect, to shield themselves from it, from the effects. And of course, that has to do with how much power they have, both kind of in terms of political power, economic power, cultural power as well. And that means that some countries in the global south are worse off when it comes to confronting climate change, because first, they don't have the resources to build fancy facilities to protect themselves. They don't have the resources to also buy what they need for climate change, say, water and seeds that can be cropped under warmer conditions, and many other aspects. So that's kind of why it is important to also see climate change from a southern perspective.
Thank you, David. So this is a big question to ask you to cover in sort of a few minutes, but could you give us a sense of how criminology as a discipline has responded to climate change?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because it's in the past 10 years that criminology has been studying more and more climate change. I like to think about the way criminology has undertaken climate change as a wheel. So there are 6 parts of that wheel, and movements in one of them moves the others. So kind of we can differentiate between, for instance, how criminologists have studied the causes of climate change. So there are people like Rob White who study the carbon criminals. So how different people contribute to climate change. And that's also taken from both a legal perspective in terms of crimes, environmental crimes, but also from a harm perspective, what causes harm even though it's legal. There are others researching the consequences of climate change in terms of harms as well. So the people affected by it, say those who have to move, the climate refugees, but also from a non-speciesist stance. So the harms for the non-human animals. So the many who are dying because they are dehydrated and many other reasons. And of course, there are others who are thinking this in terms of strain theory, how the changes in the climate produces more conflict within societies, and also kind of that increases other conflicts. There are others as well thinking in terms of how to prevent this, so more like, preventive criminology. What can we do about this? What are the measures we can implement, laws and so on. And there are some others thinking about the secondary crimes. So climate change sets the scene very nicely for some more crimes, either for those who have to find ways to survive because they lost their main source of income. So say a farmer who cannot crop anymore, and then he engages with, say, kidnapping just to have some income. And that's what we call post-structural violence, those who are victimized and then become the victimizers. So those are roughly kind of the main ways criminologists have engaged with climate change.
Thank you, David. That was an excellent overview in quite a short space of time. I wanted to ask you specifically about the issue of knowledge production. So recently I've been reading Agazzino's work from 2004 on criminology as a colonial project. And one of the points he raises is that criminological knowledge tends to be created in the West and exported elsewhere. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on, I guess, the extent to which you think like the challenges that you outline in relation to climate change and the way in which criminology engages with it are shaped by or like affected by those sort of knowledge production and power dynamics within the field.
Yeah, I think it's not only the field, but I think it's the sciences in general, right? So sciences are very Western-centric. And that means a modern way of seeing the world. And that means believing that humans can understand everything and control everything. And it kind of goes back to Bauman theorization of modernity, how people try to divide the world into small pieces, atoms, and try to modify some of those pieces under the belief that we can control and predict what will happen. That happens in any sciences, and that's the whole idea as well of development. Development says if we use reason and proof, then we can shape and modify the world the way we want, right? And that kind of also entails this belief that humans are superior than other species, that we can control everything, and that development is a linear process towards kind of more technology, more industrialization, and so on. And that also applies to criminology, right? When it comes to climate change, it's all the sciences that are thinking in this way, thinking, okay, how can we use this modern way of seeing the world to deal with climate change? And then we come with all the, say, green technologies that are also thought in that direction. Kind of, if we develop more technology, we can keep producing, we can keep consuming, so we don't have to change anything structurally. We don't have to change our culture. We don't have to change our production system. We just have to keep developing, right? Kind of developing technologies and applying more modern technologies. So that's sciences in general. Now, the problem with criminology is where does the knowledge come from? And where do the researchers come from? And where is criminology funded from, right? And this is very much in the global north as well. There are many green criminologists who are very critical and are aware of this, colonial legacies in climate change, but still there are many voices in the global south that are not heard because there are no resources for this. So still, it is still somehow skewed knowledge in that sense. But I, of course, have to also say that green criminologists are very aware of these challenges and are trying to do something about this.
Yeah. In terms of your own work then, where you write about Southern Green Criminology, like what does that look like?
Yeah, Southern Green Criminology, it has several premises. Basically, it means being aware of the legacies of colonialism. The main idea is that colonialism happened some centuries ago, but the structures that were created under that period are still in place, right? So there's still this divide between the colonies and the colonizers. We call that either that or global north and global south, but that means that kind of colonialism, it's pretty much alive. Southern Green Criminology is about being aware of that, trying to trace the consequences of colonialism, the current consequences of colonialism, how that keeps affecting the realities and the victimization, the crimes, the harms, and so on. And then also being aware of not only those structures in terms of political power, economic power, cultural power, but also what we call coloniality, which is still the belief that it's only under the modern scientific way of producing knowledge that we can learn about the world, right? So it's also about giving or kind of creating bridges, for instance, with those who produce knowledge in different ways, right? So the people who produce knowledge in their daily life, they have to survive, they have to be creative. So indigenous peoples, farmers, and so on. So it's Southern Green Criminology relies on those voices. It's aware of colonialism, the structures that it left, the consequences. And it tries to be kind of engaged with all the injustices, environmental injustices, and so on. So that's a brief overview of the field.
Thanks, David. I guess my final question then, I would be interested to hear your reflections in terms of what academics can do, like as academics based at like institutions in the global north. What things can we do in our sort of like academic practice to try and redress that imbalance between the global north and the global south in terms of knowledge production?
Yeah, well, there are many things we can do. Of course, this is a huge challenge, and I don't think one person will change everything. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy about this podcast, because it's about kind of spreading the message and saying kind of we have to work together to change things. It could be either just integrating researchers from the global south, those voices that are not usually heard, into not only the research, because that would be somehow exploiting them as a labor force, but also in the process of knowledge production, right? So it's kind of showing that people across the world, regardless where they come from, they have the power to create valid knowledge, right? So some of the projects in which I have been engaged, also with some of our colleagues, we have worked with the indigenous communities in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Brazil, and those people we work with, they are co-authors in our articles, right? Because that's also kind of challenging a little bit the practice in criminology of, I'm the senior researcher and you are the assistants, so you produce all the data and I publish, right? So I think that's a big problem, right? Because it sends the image. It's the Europeans and it's the North Americans who can create knowledge. The others are just kind of workers. And that's the same labor division that has always existed under colonialism. So that's one of the ways, kind of respecting that power in creating knowledge, including them in the project design, in the data collection, in the analysis, and in the writing. There are many challenges along the way, of course. There are language barriers, there are cultural barriers, and so on. But that's one way to do it, right? And if we keep kind of changing that imaginary that it's only the people from the global north that can create knowledge, and we credit the people who have also been part of the project, that's one way to balance the epistemological injustice. But of course, and this is very important, there's also an economic dimension to that, because it's not like it's only the epistemological part and the knowledge creation part, but there are also other spheres connected to this. And we have to fight those injustices in our spheres, because it's the only way to counteract coloniality and colonialism. So the economic part is super important, right? So how do we distribute the research funds with the global south? Because usually what happens is that the researchers in the global south, they charge much less, and then we are very happy because we can hire many more, and that's very efficient, right? But that's not entirely fair. So it's also a little bit about that fund redistribution. And we are doing what we can. So when we get the funding, say, from the UK or Europe, what we do is we pay the researchers on the field, and then we just kind of, we work with them because we are, we have this privilege to be scholars and we get our salary and so on. So there are many ways of doing this, but it's mainly recognizing the value of the work and the knowledge of people in our location.
That's great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you for joining us today. That was fascinating.
A pleasure. Thank you.